If you're a professional brewer, you know how frustrating it can be when you go to place a yeast order and what you're looking for is out of stock. Well, Imperial Yeast is here to help by guaranteeing that commercial orders up to 20 liters of 10, yes, 10 of their most popular strains will ship free if they're not in stock when you place your order. Some of these strains include A38 Juice for those hazy IPAs, A07 Flagship, a classic in clean American styles, L13 Global, which is said to be one of the world's most popular lager strains, A44 Viking for your warm fermented beers, and so many more. So in addition to pitching right with the highest quality yeast on the market, they're promising that yeast will be ready when you need it or shipping is on them. Whether you're a pro or a home brewer, if you haven't tried Imperial Yeast in your brewery, it's time to up your game. You can check out everything Imperial Yeast has to offer and place your commercial orders at imperialyeast.com. IPA is a style that used to be known primarily for one thing, hops. Whether it was the bitterness imparted from early kettle additions or the fruity aroma from dry hopping, hops were the name of the game, while other aspects tended to be focused on a bit less, resulting in a smattering of options made with various hop varieties, but rather basic malt bills. Likely motivated by the desire to change things up, brewers of IPA began experimenting with the use of different grains, ultimately resulting in the development of a number of substyles that looked, smelled, and tasted different. This is the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and joining me on this episode to talk about a style of IPA that is largely defined by the grain used to make it is contributor Mike Neville.
Yeah, hey Marshall, I'm really looking forward to talking about this. I think out of all the IPA styles, whether it's English, American, American East Coast, West Coast, Midwest, and now the new hazy IPA, 21B might be the most interesting and fun to me because 21B includes all sorts of variations, including red, black, brown, Belgian, Brut, white, which I'm still not sure what that is.
Yeah.
And of course, Rye IPA, which is what we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah. If I'm not mistaken, Sierra Nevada's Ruthless Rye IPA was the first rye-based IPA I ever had, and unless I had one that I just didn't know rye was in. But ultimately, it inspired me to pick up a bunch of rye malt myself to experiment with in my own brewery. I ended up making a bunch of rye-based pale ale and IPA using mostly rye malt, which gave me firsthand knowledge of just what rye contributes to beer, at least on an anecdotal level. I love this stuff, and I look forward to talking about not only rye IPA in general, but your attempt to brew one using short and shoddy methods. All right, if you're a fan of this show and you'd like to receive a reward for your support, please consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. By making a small monthly pledge, you'll receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. Our guest for this month, October of 2022, is Berkeley Yeast co-founder Nick Harris. If you haven't heard of Berkeley Yeast yet, they are doing some really interesting stuff with our favorite microorganism, including bioengineering yeast strains with the goal of transforming the way we think about fermentation. Really, really cool stuff. You can learn more about everything Berkeley Yeast is up to over at berkeleyyeast.com. This is bound to be a really fascinating session. If you want to be a part of it, you have to make your pledge at patreon.com/Brewlosophy by Friday, October 28th, 2022, as Nick is going to be taking questions that Saturday, the 29th. All past sessions are stored on our private Patreon and Facebook pages, so you can go back and watch them whenever you like. Learn more about becoming a patron over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. I know the holiday season is still a couple months away, but that does not mean some of you haven't already started doing your gift shopping. I'd just like to remind you to please consider using the links found at brewlosophy.com/support. When you're shopping online, your experience won't change at all, and we get a little kickback for the referral that does help us out a ton. You can even bookmark those links to make them easier to use. And if you wouldn't mind letting us know what you think about this show by leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcast or wherever it is you listen to podcasts, we really would appreciate that as well. Feedback is brought to you by Clawhammer Supply, who are known for their incredible all-in-one electric brewing systems. I've had the opportunity to brew on both the 120 and 240 volt systems, and I'm telling you, these things are legit, efficient, easy to use with a relatively small footprint. You will not be disappointed with one of these units. Plus, the guys behind the company run a killer YouTube channel, which you can find by searching YouTube for Clawhammer Supply. If you're in the market for electric brewing gear, make sure to check out what Clawhammer Supply has to offer at clawhammersupply.com. And don't forget to let them know Brewlosophy sent you when you're checking out. Again, that's clawhammersupply.com. brew-last.com. Ryan Bailey wrote in with some feedback on a question we responded to on our latest Brew and A episode, the one about using sulfites for bottle conditioning. Ryan said, that question made me wonder if some people who bottle are maybe ignoring a simpler solution to cold side oxidation. When I bottle maltier beers or kettle sours, I use the traditional bottling bucket method because I feel it helps separate the beer from the trub. But when I bottle anything hoppy, I just bottle straight from the fermenter to keep the transfer as closed as possible. I use a 3-gallon Fermonster with a spigot, which I attached a bottling wand to, and then I simply dose each individual bottle with half a teaspoon of table sugar. So far, this has worked just fine. I had a hazy IPA that I tried 7 days after conditioning, and then again at 10 days, which was when I added the entire batch of bottles to my fridge. I did feel the color darken slightly between 7 and 10 days, but otherwise it tasted great. I actually found a bottle in the back of my fridge 4 months later. It hadn't darkened any further and still tasted good. It just makes me wonder if simply removing the bottling bucket from the situation would solve a lot of people's issues with bottle conditioning and oxidation. I think the ability of that secondary fermentation in the bottle to scrub oxygen is overlooked. I know that by dosing individual bottles, it makes it tougher to dial in specific carbonation levels, but I'll take that over purple beer any day and maybe stop the conditioning process 7 to 10 days instead of the typical 2 weeks.
Yeah, that's an interesting... It's been so long since I bottled beer from a bottling bucket, so it's been a while. So yeah, if you're going to dose each individual bottle, it is going to take a lot longer and probably be a little more painful than going to a bottling bucket and introducing the sugar all into once, and stirring or mixing, however. But it seems like that might be a way to bring down that cold side oxidation. That's a good idea.
Yeah, I like you, Mike, I have not bottled beer in many, many years. But there were a couple batches I made just before I switched to kegging where I did basically what Ryan is suggesting by, bottling the beer and then adding like a carb drop or whatever. Now, these were not hazy IPA, and my concern at the time wasn't so much oxidation as it was dirtying up a bottling bucket, spending the time to go through that process. But it did work fine, at least per my memory. And I would think that bottling directly from the fermenter rather than racking to a bottling bucket first would, at the very least, reduce the risk of oxygen exposure and future cold side oxidation. So it does seem like a valid idea. That said, Ryan did mention that he observed some darkening between 7 and 10 days in the bottle, which does indicate to me that there probably was at least some oxygen exposure there. And even at that tiny little bit is enough for me to not want to do it. I would, I think I said this in response in that episode that Ryan's referring to. I would just get a keg, and you can do a gravity fed, purge that keg, and then you can gravity feed your beer into that keg with some priming sugar in the bottom of the keg, stir it up, and at the very least, then you're racking from a fermenter into a closed keg, and then you can bottle from that keg. I know kegs are like $60 now, but I'd rather spend $60 on a vessel like a keg that I know is going to be closed than $20 on a bottling bucket and risk oxidation. That's just my thought. Yep. But Ryan, if it works for you, that's what matters. So thanks for the feedback, man. If you have show feedback, you could send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or leave us a note on social media. Real quick, I just wanted to remind all of our listeners that while our YouTube channel is currently inactive, largely inactive, I should say, we do have one, and we'd love for you to subscribe now so you don't miss anything cool that might be coming in the future. All you have to do is go to YouTube and search up Brewlosophy. Also, to those who listen to this show and or the Brew Lab podcast on YouTube, I know it's annoying, but we're soon going to be pulling our podcast from that platform, so you'll have to find something else that works. When we return from this break, the focus will be on Rye IPA. If there's one thing I know about brewers, it's that we love to eat just as much as we love to drink. And when I eat, I put hot sauce on pretty much everything. Lately, that hot sauce has come from Atlanta Burns, whose mission is to make uniquely flavored, spicy hot sauces that add a new dimension to your meal. Based out of Atlanta, Georgia, Atlanta Burns uses only the highest quality ingredients to produce handcrafted hot sauces like Jalapeno Business and my personal favorite, Sherman's Ghost. It's so good. Right now, Atlanta Burns is offering listeners of the Brewlosophy podcast an exclusive discount of 10% off their line of killer hot sauces. Just head over to atlburns.com and use code Brewlosophy at checkout. Again, that's atlburns.com and code Brewlosophy to get 10% off your order. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com. And be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you. Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code BREWPOD, that's BRUPOD, at AtlanticBrewSupply.com. As I imagine is the case for many, soon after I got into homebrewing, I became obsessed with brewing the hoppiest beer I could. And at first that meant bitter, but it soon morphed into just, fruity hop character. And we wanted to get the most punch you in the face hop character possible. And once I was consistently making what I thought was good IPA, I began to branch out by using less conventional ingredients, one of which was rye malt. Obviously, these days, there's nothing terribly unique about using rye to make hoppy styles. In fact, it's become so commonplace that the BJCP includes it in their style guidelines as a subset of American IPA. Before we really get into Rye IPA too deeply, let's talk a little bit about rye in general.
Yeah, so Rye IPA, it's hard to say because there's not really a lot of history out there with Rye IPA. It seems like it was more like a homebrewing thing where homebrewers were experimenting with different types of grains, and rye was just that first one, or maybe not the first one, but just one of those out there that you begin swapping portions of some of your malt or character malts for rye.
Well, yeah, so I had the opportunity to have lunch with Brian Grossman out in Asheville, North Carolina. This is Ken Grossman's son, who runs the North Carolina Sierra Nevada. And I believe it was him who I was having this conversation with. And he made a comment that so many of the things we were talking about, some of the beers that they've made that, they kind of get swept away and they're no longer around. And he made a comment that a lot of those were inspired by homebrewers, by what they saw homebrewers doing and posting about online and such. That really does seem to be, based on what I could find on the internet at least, that really does seem to be how Rye IPA kind of came to be. Homebrewers were like, well, hey, we like rye bread. We like, rye is just another cereal grain. Why don't we use this, experiment with it a little bit in beer and see what we can get? And lo and behold, you've got, commercial brewers nowadays like Sierra Nevada making Rye IPA, and I think it's delicious. I have a love of Rye IPA for reasons other than what I think a lot of people comment on when it comes to the use of rye in beer. But yeah, the history of it is relatively small. It seems like over the last 20 years or so. Now, that's not to say that people weren't brewing with rye,
right,
long ago. We know that they were using whatever they could to make fermentable, sweet wort, so that they could get it lit on the weekends, as it were.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's just talk about some generals of rye, right? So rye is a cereal grass that's grown primarily as a grain in food, or as a grain in foods. So breads, breakfast cereals, whiskeys, and what we're talking about today, beer. And it's said to contribute some fairly unique flavors. And what's almost always kind of noted with rye is that spiciness that you get. I don't know if I get like a ton of spiciness when I brew with rye, depending on the levels, of course, but it seems like that is always a note when you are looking for or talking about a rye beer.
We did an episode a while back on just using rye in beer. We weren't talking about Rye IPA specifically. And in that one, I made a comment that yielded quite a bit of feedback. Mm-hmm. And it's that I've used a ton of rye over the years. I love rye in beer. I've made rye saison. I've used rye in American brown ale. I've used it in IPA and pale ale. I love the stuff. I've never gotten a spicy character from it. What I get from it is kind of this almost like a sharp, doughy character when used in higher amounts, but it does not come across as spice. I am of the belief that the reason spicy, that descriptor, is associated with rye is because of because of the use of certain other spices when in rye bread, in breads that are heavily have a high amount of rye in it. So you've got like pumpernickel, or you've got rye bread with caraway seeds, and people kind of think that the rye is going to contribute like a caraway type character to beer. I just don't get that at all. What I get more than anything is the viscosity, the increased body, because of the high beta glucan content in rye. And to me, that's the main thing that I get. Plus it adds, like I said, the kind of a sharper doughy note. What do you get when you're using rye, Mike?
Yeah, no. So I was just thinking about when you said that, like, I was thinking that maybe the spiciness, like the spicy, peppery kind of, quote, notes that come from rye, maybe they're coming from some other like thing in your brain, right? So exactly. I think rye definitely brings like beer dryness down. So I guess I could see like in your head thinking that, like equating that with a spicy kind of character,
sure.
Right? That bringing that dryness down. And then also, like you said, brewing, rye with Saison, if you're using a Saison yeast, you're going to expect some of those maybe spicy, peppery, yeast characteristics that maybe that's where that, rye equals spice equals pepper thing might be coming from. Like you, I don't really get a ton of spice. Like I said, I think it brings it down, the dryness down. So, depending on what kind of other, malts, hops, yeast you're using, I guess I could get a spiciness, but I think just like you, it seems like more of a mouthfeel sensation.
Yeah.
It's kind of bringing up that body while still being, being more viscous and bringing up body while still being dry at the same time.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the unique characteristics about rye is that you get this increased viscosity, which is a unique thing, right? People think, oh, if I just mash higher, I'll get more body. We've not been able to flesh that out, on an experimental level. But rye, almost 100% of the time, you will experience increased viscosity in your mouth, and yet the beer is still easy to drink and feels dry after you swallow. It's just a really unique characteristic. That's what I love about using rye, is that you can do that. You can kind of modulate the body without really contributing any more sugar or other things that people think you have to do to increase body. But again, yep. I have never in my life, in all of the hundreds of batches that I've brewed with rye, maybe it's not 100 batches yet, but I've used rye a lot and I've never gotten spicy. If you get spicy, go and reach out to us. That's just something that I have not experienced. And again, I think there is an association there with rye and the types of food it's typically used to make. Now, when it comes to brewing with rye, usually rye comes in various forms. You can get flaked rye, you can get rye malt. I think that's probably what most people are using. And they malt it just the same way they do barley, right? They let it sprout and then they go and they kiln it to a relatively low SRM or low degree Lovibond color. And then you mill it up and you use it. There are some considerations though that I think people need to have in mind if they're planning on brewing, particularly with larger portions of rye.
Yeah, I mean, one of those considerations is, we've said it already a couple times here, the viscosity that you're going to get, and that might hinder your ability to lauter, in the mash. So you want to consider maybe using rice hulls or, making sure you have, high enough portion of a base malt or your other malts with husks to kind of create that filter bed so you don't get a stuck mash or things like that.
Yeah.
So I think when it comes to lautering, it just kind of is important to know about your system, right? So if you're using a brew in a bag system or a brew in a basket, then you're just lifting that out and you can just let everything drain. So the viscosity that you're going to get in the mash might not be as detrimental, right? So you're still going to be able to extract all that sweet wort.
Yeah.
But if you're doing like a standard mash tun sort of thing, it's just knowing your system. It's, what's the portion of rye you're using, and then just adding, rice hulls to or mashing out, mashing out at a higher mash temperature to hopefully decrease some of that viscosity so you can get all that sweet wort out into the kettle.
Yeah, and the key there, I mean, you mentioned it, that rye is a huskless grain, unlike barley or other brewing grains. There's no husk on rye, and so in addition to having this high beta glucan content, which is what increases that viscosity, it doesn't have the benefit of the husk to filter out that thickness. So it's kind of like a double-edged sword in many ways. But again, if you're using certain, mashing techniques like brew in a bag, you really don't have to worry too much about it. And you can actually go with pretty high percentages of rye malt. It's just something you got to keep in mind. It's funny. If you go and you look at, somebody posts a popular recipe or something like that on a forum, and then you go and you look at all the comments, if there's rye in that recipe, you will almost always run across multiple people saying that they got a stuck sparge. And a lot of them are using, a batch sparge method, something like that, where they can't really do a mash out too easily. So they can't raise the temperature of that mash, very easily to a point where it actually thins that wort out. I know I've experienced that. I'll tell that story a little bit later, but it's just something you have to keep in mind when you're brewing with rye. Other than that, at least in my experience, there's really not much else special about brewing a rye IPA over your regular American IPA. So now let's break the description down a little bit that the BJCP offers, just to give a good idea of what to expect with a rye IPA.
Yeah, so the appearance you're looking at, color-wise, it's going to be medium gold to a light reddish amber. Clarity, it's generally going to be clear, though, because of the high hopping, in the kettle, in the whirlpool, and in the dry hop. Haze is okay.
Yeah.
And acceptable. And then foam, it's going to be white, off-white with a good retention there.
Yeah, in terms of clarity, this is one of those ones where I've gotten into conversations with other brewers. IPA in general does not have to be crystal clear. I prefer it that way because I think it's pretty, but that's subjective preference. Because of the high hopping rates and the polyphenols that we know come along with that, a light haze is fine. But rye IPA is not to look like your the Alchemist Heady Topper hazy IPA.
No, it shouldn't look muddy or.
Yeah, exactly. It's supposed to be kind of clear. You should be able to kind of see through it. It's just that you've got that haze from all the dry hopping and whatnot, and that's perfectly acceptable. Again, there are ways to get it bright, and I think that's pretty neat as well. Aromatically speaking, prominent to intense hop aroma. Just think your classic American IPA. It should be those common modern or new world hops like Citra, Galaxy, Mosaic, stuff like that. Perfectly acceptable in rye IPA. A low peppery rye malt aroma is one that the BJCP notes that I kind of shake my head at it because I've never gotten peppery rye malt. And to be honest, I don't see how that would be appealing with those citrusy hops that are out there. I mean, what are your thoughts on that, Mike?
Yeah, I think it's a delicate game. Like if you are getting some pepperiness, it's you just want to be able to not match, but complement whatever hops you're using with whatever pepperiness may be coming from the rye malt.
I'll tell you, if I made a rye IPA and I got a peppery aroma, I would think that I picked up a contamination. I would think that that was some sort of a spice phenol, from a wild yeast or something. But hey, again, I understand that there's this association between like rye malt and spice. So if our brains think that they perceive it, then that is one's reality. That's perfectly fine. Again, clean fermentation profile, which kind of flies in the face of peppery yet again, but whatever. Light esters are okay, and a light alcohol aroma is optional. If you're going for a heavier, higher alcohol rye IPA, if you pick up a little alcohol in the aroma, that's fine as well.
Yeah, and I think just to touch on that, when you commented on the clean fermentation profile, it's you may not get the pepperiness in the aroma. It's okay. It's almost like the haze in the appearance, right? It could be optional. It doesn't have to be there. They call it out as very low. So like if you're not even picking it up in the aroma, that you shouldn't be dinged too much as far as maybe like a competition goes. So moving on to flavor, we're looking at medium to very high hop flavor, right? Same as the aroma. We want those classic IPA hops. It's going to be low to medium low, clean, supportive malt background. And then there could be some optional light caramel and toast is acceptable depending on what kind of malts you're using.
Yeah.
For the grain, again, we're going back to this low to moderate grainy, peppery, spicy from the rye flavors. That adds to the dry finish. Again, that's what the BJCP calls out in the into the style. And then an assertive bitterness that's not harsh, right?
Yeah.
So your classic American IPA, nothing too harsh, but you need that punch of hop bitterness there. And then a low esters and light alcohol flavor is also optional.
Yeah, so the flavor basically follows the aroma. This is very typical of your standard American IPA. I don't pick up the that's another one that confuses me. Is I would have a difficult time, admittedly, parsing out hop fruitiness from low esters. I would just think that the high hopping rate of a rye IPA would cover up those esters. But hey, some people have are more sensitive to those things than I am. I know that. So mouthfeel wise, I think this is a very important one. You're looking for a medium light to medium body. That differs a bit from your classic American IPA, which you want to be very crisp and light on your palate. It can be smooth with a lightly creamy texture, medium to medium high carbonation. Absolutely key in this style to break through some of that beta glucan thickness, in my opinion. It's what helps to make it so drinkable. A little bit of low alcohol warmth and higher ABV versions is perfectly acceptable. Again, no harshness whatsoever. You want that bitterness there, but you don't want it biting. And in my opinion, when brewing these using more traditional approaches, I found a blend of something like Magnum with just a touch of Chinook at 60 minutes to get that kind of sharp bitterness without being too harsh really works well. But that's just my experience.
Yeah, and I think the mouthfeel section is really where rye IPA kind of shines for me, right? You're looking, like you said, for that kind of creamy texture, a little higher body, but it still should be dry, and it shouldn't linger on the palate at all. It should finish very dry.
Yeah, absolutely. Vital stats wise, pretty simple. 1056 to 1075 OG with a finishing gravity of 1008 to 1014, which results in a beer that can range between 5.5 and 8% ABV. Quite a range there, but I think that's pretty typical of IPA in general. IBU wise, you're looking at 50 to 75. Again, we know how difficult that is to measure for homebrewers, but you want something that's assertive but not harsh. And then color wise, 6 to 14 SRM. So nice, pale, kind of golden, up to a reddish color.
Yeah, all very kind of standard, other than maybe the color a little bit, all very standard American IPA kind of numbers.
Exactly.
Right? So, yeah. So looking at some of the characteristic ingredients, how are we going to make this thing? Malt wise, it can be almost any kind of base malt as your kind of underlying malt. So a pale two-row, a pale ale malt, Maris Otter works great. I've used Golden Promise before. That works great. Pilsner. And then you're obviously going to want to use a decent portion of rye malt, anywhere from maybe 10 to 20% rye malt. And then you could also consider maybe layering in some flaked rye.
Yeah, flaked rye is one that I've seen more and more people using lately, and I just think it's kind of neat. It's kind of like flaked oats if you've ever used that. But rye malt is what I keep on hand. I always have rye malt on hand, and that's what I use. There are some things people will say, rye malt is a smaller kernel than barley, and so you might have to squeeze your mill together. I've never had an issue with that, and I get about the same efficiency when I'm using rye as I do when I'm using barley. So, in terms of hops, we already talked about this. You're looking for high oil, notably pungent modern American and or New World hops. Some of my favorite: Citra, Centennial, Cascade, Mosaic, Galaxy, El Dorado, stuff like that. Something that's going to impart just that really, I don't want to use the word juicy because I feel like that's been taken over by the hazy folks. But that really fruity, just that really kind of pungent, fruity hop character. Fresher the better, in my opinion. You get that nice, fresh, like you're walking through a hop field smell from a nice rye IPA. And in a weird way, the way my mind kind of envisions rye IPA is that increased body, that viscosity, almost holds those hop aromatics like up better. It sounds crazy, but that's how my brain thinks about it.
I can see that. Yeah,
you know what I'm saying? And like when I pour a nice rye IPA, I can smell it when it's coming off the tap, and that's what I want. And so again, just so hop-wise, you're looking for that, and then yeast-wise, obviously, any neutral ale yeast that attenuates well. And I personally, just because they're of English origin, does not make them not neutral. But AO7 Flagship, that's your classic Chico strain. That's a very popular one for styles like this. But I really love using AO9 Pub. That's the fuller strain with this style, and you just ferment it at about 66 Fahrenheit or 19 C, and boy, does does it help to bring up some of those? To me, it just accentuates the hop notes. And again, you get a little bit less attenuation. And when I use pub, I get a little bit more body with it as well. And so I love it. I think it's probably my favorite IPA yeast.
Yeah, no, I love using English yeast for IPA. I think it's a great choice, especially pub. The other one yeast I wanted to call out that I've had success with is the Imperial's Go3 Dieter. The Kolsch yeast is just phenomenal. If you maybe don't want as much yeast character that pub's going to bring out, I think that Go3 is just clean. It just sits behind and just allows everything else to the malt and the hops to come forward. It's just great.
Absolutely. And actually, just recently, there's been some talk about certain lager strains, most notably the Weihenstephan strain, which is L13 Global by Imperial, having, when fermented warm in hoppier beers, having the ability to, I believe, free bound thiols. So don't imprison yourself when it comes to yeast. Try new things. I've definitely made some hoppy IPA using lager yeast fermented warm, and it works phenomenally well. So many options there. What you want in essence, though, what you want is a relatively neutral yeast that's going to allow those hops to shine with that nice rye malt character.
Yeah. And before we move on to the next section here, last thing on ingredients is, the BJCP calls out to make sure you're not using caraway and oak that is inappropriate. So like we do associate, a lot of these, rye beers with, or at least rye foods, right, with caraway. So if you're thinking about a competition setting, those two things would be inappropriate in this specific style.
It's not supposed to taste like rye bread. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
Because there's caraway in rye bread, and that's what I'm saying. Is I get it though. I'm gonna stop harping on it because I know that it's gonna be beating a dead horse here. So, in terms of a traditional brewing process for rye IPA, I'm gonna run through my thoughts on this really quickly, Mike, and you can kind of cut me off if there's something you disagree with. It's really no different than any other IPA brewing, and in my opinion, the American brewing methods are fairly simple. There's nothing. We're not doing a decoction mash. You're not doing anything like that. There's no extended lagering. In terms of water chemistry, I prefer a mineral profile that favors sulfate to enhance that hop crispness, and again to balance out the viscosity of that rye malt. To me, that's what sulfates do. So I'll use a little bit more gypsum than I will, say, calcium chloride in a style like this. Some prefer a more balanced profile because they like that, what I refer to as kind of that warm malty thing to hold up those hops. Totally acceptable. You can do whatever you want in terms of water chem. This is a relatively new style. 60-minute to 90-minute mash at about 148 to 154 Fahrenheit. That's 64 to 68 C, just to ensure good beta amylase activity and thus good fermentability. You're going to boil for 60 to 90 minutes to achieve adequate isomerization of alpha acids, to make sure that you get that assertive bitterness expected in this style, but also to reduce the risk of DMS, because we know if you don't boil for at least an hour, you can get corny flavors because of DMS in your beer, right? Chill quickly to ensure a good cold break. You want this to be a fairly clear wort and clear beer. Rack as little trub to the fermenter as possible, and then ferment at your standard ale temperatures. Like I said, I prefer 66F for pretty much everything ale-wise. That's 19C. I know, Mike, you tend to go with 68F or 20C.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that's a big difference, but...
No, I don't think it's that big of a difference. I think it's kind of a personal preference thing.
Wherever you have your things set, you just leave it alone, right? that's me.
Yeah. I mean, if it's worked great for you at 66, that's great, and it works great for me at 68, and we'll just keep rolling with it. Again, this beer is expected to be somewhat clear, so you can fine or filter it and not have any issues. Though there's a lot of people out there who believe that you will reduce overall hop character by fining or filtering your beer. So if if you're one of those people, if what you're looking for is the most pungent hop character possible, just let the beer condition on its own until it's not, murky. And then you're going to package it, carbonate it, and serve it just as you would any other American IPA. I like to carbonate it fairly well. You want it to have a nice fizz. You don't want it to be like soda, obviously, but that 2.5 to 2.7 range, volumes of CO2 range works beautifully for me. And again, it helps to kind of cut through the viscosity of that rye and really keep this, moderate bodied beer drinkable and refreshing. Again, like I said, it's a super easy style to make. Was there anything I said there, Mike, that you're like, I don't do it that way? But no, I just want to, what you said about the carbonation, like having a higher carbonation in IPAs, I think that's a great thing too, not only to bring down some of that body, make it crisper, but, that hop aroma
Yes.
should be like jumping out of the glass, and that carbonation is going to help, get that up to your nose faster.
Yep. Absolutely. There's plenty of good when it comes to carbonating beer properly. It's one of those things that I'm absolutely obsessed with. So, well, what do you look for in a good example of rye IPA? If you're going out to a pub and you see they have a rye IPA on tap, what's going to help you to feel like this is a really good version of rye IPA?
Yeah. So the very first thing is, as the beer sits down in front of you, just like I said, having that smell come right up to your nose is kind of the first thing I'm looking for. Of course, clean fermentation. You don't want any you don't want any off flavors, excuse me. You want it to be super hoppy, have some breadiness, have some very supporting malt backbone to it. And then that spicy, possibly that spiciness will be there depending on, the portions of rye used, but I don't particularly look for the spiciness. I'm more looking for that dryness that we're supposed to get from rye.
I have a feeling though, Mike, that if you looked for the spiciness, you just might find it, because that's
I know. I could talk myself into it.
Exactly.
I'm sure.
Think yourself into it, as it were, right? I mean, that's how us humans are. It's such an interesting thing. If you're out there looking for, I agree with you. That's exactly what I look for in a good example of rye IPA. Basically, a super fruity, American IPA that just has a different texture to it when I sip on it. So if you're looking for examples of this, there really aren't that many that I can think of. The two that the BJCP lists, I've actually been fortunate enough to have both a few times. Sierra Nevada Ruthless Rye, I drink whenever they release it, and I believe they just announced they're going to release it this season. I hope that's the case. Absolutely phenomenal example from a phenomenal brewery. You have to get your hands on some of that if you can. Founders Red's Rye IPA as well is a very good one. Both of these beers tend to sway a little bit more on like the red IPA spectrum in terms of color. I've made so many very, very pale rye IPA. That's my jam. I love what it does in those, in part because when you contrast it with your classic pale American IPA, to me, that's where you really start to notice those differences. When you start kind of upping the color and doing other things, it works beautifully. It's just not as easy to compare to, a classic American IPA. But those are some notable commercial examples that, if you're out and about looking for stuff to try, if you don't want to brew one yet, you can check those out. Now, in my experience, there's really only one difference between brewing rye IPA and brewing other types of IPA, and it's that you have to mind your lautering, since rye has a tendency to gum things up. The first time I ever used rye, I was still using the old converted cooler mash tun with the that braided stainless hose at the bottom, and I made a beer that had, I think it was 25% rye malt, which was a mistake. I realized it made collecting my sweet wort nearly impossible, to the point I had to put my spoon down and gently scrape that tube the entire 45 minutes I was running off the sweet wort. And dude, I mean, usually it would take me 5 minutes to collect my first runnings. It took me 45 minutes. And of course at the time I'm thinking, hot side oxidation, I'm going to ruin this beer. It ended up being absolutely phenomenal. In fact, my brother-in-law came over and was like, what is this stuff? It's so good. So I was really proud of it, but I did learn my lesson there. I'm a brew in a bag brewer now, and I've never had to worry about it. Well, Mike, you recently brewed up a rye IPA using a bunch of less conventional methods, and then you served it to tasters for evaluation. Results from that when we're back from this break. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer, and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. Chilling wort can be a chore, especially after a long brew day, but not with the Exchillerator Counterflow Chiller, which can chill a 5-gallon or 19-liter batch of wort in 5 minutes or less, leading to a strong cold break and clear wort in the fermenter. Brewlosophy's Matt Del Fiacco uses the Exchillerator Max and absolutely loves it. In addition to improved chilling efficiency, every Exchillerator comes with a 5-year warranty that covers the entire chiller for manufacturer defects. If you're looking to up your chilling game and a CFC is right for you, head over to exchillerator.com today. Given its strength and the sheer amount of hops that go into it, many brewers feel it's important to follow certain rules when making IPA, including those with a good portion of rye in the grist. Mike, you recently made one where a bunch of brewing rules were broken. Why don't you tell us about that?
Yeah, so I started this brew day at 3:28 p.m. In my 220-volt Brow Supply electric system. I collected the full volume of tap water, added a Camden tablet, and adjusted to my desired mineral profile. The recipe for this batch, the grain bill, it's 75% pale malt, 16% rye malt, 6% Munich, and 3% special roast.
So 16% rye malt is the key there. A lot of people have preferences for their how they like their American IPA grain bill in general. And if you were to add that 16% rye malt to the pale malt, I think 6% Munich and 3% special roast adds a nice toasty thing to it, which again, if you look back at the BJCP description, is perfectly appropriate in rye IPA. So I actually really wanted to try this beer because of your grain bill. I've never brewed with special roast, Mike. That's kind of a little secret that people may not know about me. It's a grain that I've never used.
I think special roast, we're going to go on a special roast tangent, but it kind of gets a weird, it's kind of a weird malt because it says roast, right? So you think like super dark, but it's actually kind of like a biscuity, like a Victory kind of malt that just kind of adds another layer of complexity. I like to use it in small portions and in beers like this.
Awesome. Yeah. So you got your grain bill ready, and then let's talk about the rest of this crazy brewing process.
Yeah, so when the water was up to strike temperature, I added the grains and stirred to incorporate before checking to make sure that I hit my target mash temperature, which was 151 Fahrenheit or 66 C. The mash was left for just 30 minutes, after which the grains were removed. Just lifted the basket and, let that drain into the kettle. The wort was then boiled for 30 minutes, and the hop additions, at 30 minutes, I put in 28 grams of Triumph, 21 grams of CTZ went in at 20 minutes, 28 grams each of Columbus Lupomax, Galaxy, and Topaz at 5.
Oh, that sounds so good. That's such a great hop regimen there. Just again, to point out, 30-minute mash rest instead of the 60 plus that most people say is necessary. Yep. And a 30-minute boil, even more scary to a lot of people, rather than the 60 to 90 minute to drive off the DMS. Obviously, you had to increase that 30-minute hop addition to ensure that you got at least predicted IBU, right, to get that bitterness.
That's right.
That's one of the things you just have to do when it comes to brewing this way. When you're abbreviating the boil like that, you have to get that bitterness. A lot of people will go with a higher alpha hop so that they can do that without having to add too much vegetal matter to their beer. But 1 ounce, 28 grams is 1 ounce at 30 minutes sounds perfectly acceptable to me.
Yeah, that I really like that Triumph too, because it is a higher alpha hop, and it just kind of gives that just a really clean character I've found. So. Yeah. So after the boil was complete, I chilled the wort to about 69 Fahrenheit, 20 C with my jaded Hydra immersion chiller. And a refractometer reading showed that the wort was at my target 1065.
So that's pretty impressive if you ask me. You got 63% brewhouse efficiency. If you had mashed for the 60 minutes, we know that your brewhouse efficiency is closer to, I think, 72 or 73 fairly consistently. But mashing for 30 minutes, boiling for 30 minutes, and you still broke that 60% floor, I think that's pretty awesome and nothing that I would worry about. That's maybe a quarter pound, maybe half a pound grain difference in order for you to achieve the same OG as you would using a more classic brewing process.
Yeah, and it's totally worth it to me. Just the time you save, the whole half hour is just it's money. So.
Yeah, and it blows by, doesn't it? When you're doing it.
It does. Yeah. It is a hectic brew day, that's for sure. But
sure.
Yeah, it does go by quick. So after I took the the refractometer reading. I racked the wort to, and this is different than some of the other short and shotties we've done in the past. So what I did here was I had a previous Hop Chronicle batch that I had just kegged a couple hours before, and I had not cleaned the fermenter. And I opened the fermenter up and racked the wort from the Rye IPA directly into the fermenter that had the Hop Chronicle batch in it. So, that batch obviously brewed with the AO7 flagship yeast, and I just went with that. I didn't.
So, Mike, are you saying that you significantly overpitched for this?
I significantly overpitched. I mean, I'm
So
not sure I
shoddy.
could have overpitched anymore. Yeah.
All right.
And yeah, everything that was left in the kettle, there was a dry hop addition, whatever kettle hops or trub that was in that Hop Chronicle batch was still in the fermenter. So all of that from the short and shoddy rye got racked into that fermenter. So then I just closed it up and just, set the temperature control and that was it.
Let her rip. I'm willing to bet that fermentation kicked off incredibly fast.
Very quick. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I don't even think it wasn't even a couple hours. It was like that. It seemed like maybe an hour, and you could start to see the bubbles just start going. So
yeah, I've done the same thing a couple of times for I think one of them was a short and shoddy, and I was just shocked at how quickly fermentation kicked off. Now, obviously, when you significantly overpitch, there are some concerns related with that. Maybe over attenuation, or you get a yeasty character in beer, which to me tastes kind of earthy. It's an unpleasant earthiness. But that's the risk you were willing to take for this to sacrifice this short and shoddy rye IPA. So
yeah, that's right. Yeah, so the brew day ended at 5:34 p.m. for a total brew time of 2 hours and 6 minutes.
Woo, buddy.
Yeah, it was quick. So like I said, the fermenter was connected to my glycol rig where the temperature was set to 68 F or 20 C. And then once fermentation started to take off, I connected it to a CO2 capture device, allowing a filled keg of sanitizer to be purged completely with the CO2 that was being generated from that rye IPA.
Nice.
Yep. So then 6 days into fermentation, I added the dry hops, which included 57 grams of Galaxy and 28 grams each of Columbus Lupomax and Topaz, and then allowed that to sit for 4 days with no signs of fermentation left. I took a hydrometer measurement showing that the beer was at a very dry 1008 final gravity for a total ABV of 7.5.
That is one stiff rye IPA. I mean, 1008 FG, and the neat thing is what you would expect, having used what you use like 16 or 18% rye, you would expect that despite being 1008 FG to still have that nice kind of creamy mouthfeel, a little bit of body that holds up those hops. It's one of the beautiful things about this style.
Yeah, absolutely. So after I took the final gravity measurement, I cold crashed to about 38 F or 3C under pressure, then pressure transferred the beer to a CO2 purged keg. And then the beer was burst carbonated for 24 hours before gas was reduced to serving pressure. And I let that beer condition for about a week before I served it to participants for evaluation.
Excellent. And you get to this 1 week. I mean, obviously we're sampling those beers like the day after we keg them, but you get to that 1 week as you're going to serve them to tasters. And what does this beer look like in the glass?
Yeah, to me, the beer had a moderate haze. It still had some clarity to it. You could see that, some fingers on the other side of the glass, but you could tell it was pretty hazy. I mean,
you did a 4 ounce dry hop. That makes perfect sense to me that it would have some of that dry hop
absolutely.
Haze, but yeah.
The color wise, it was a pale gold and had a nice fluffy white head with good retention. So
I'm looking at the picture right now, and I just want to pour a pint of that beer and drink it myself. That's like my favorite looking beer. That's just nice pale gold. A little more clear would be cool, but I mean, you can tell in the bottom of the glass, you could still kind of see through the beer, but that nice creamy head. Oh man, it looks so good.
Yep.
So of course, after you're done, eyeing this beer and developing whatever it is you think about how pretty it looks, you sampled it. What were your thoughts before you served it to tasters? What were your thoughts about how this beer came out, just overall?
Yeah, so the beer was very classic IPA with some of that rye kind of creaminess. It had big, bright notes of tropical fruit, grapefruit. A lot of that dank came through from what I think was probably the CTZ Lupomax in the aroma, and that carried very nicely into the flavor. Like I said, the rye seemed to bump up the mouthfeel a bit, and I felt that the beer may have had some, like a very low spiciness, but again, I don't know if that was playing into my brain or not, but I could see some very low spiciness there.
I wonder if some of the hops you used didn't contribute. See, this is just my cynicism when it comes to the whole rye spice thing, but maybe some of the hops, I can't imagine with how vital and viable the yeast that you pitched onto it. I can't imagine that was a yeast phenol or anything like that. But
yeah, I agree. And I think, maybe we'll talk about it a little later, but I think the hop combination that I used, it was definitely delicious, but I might try something a little different in the future because It seemed like I was mixing some of those old classic C hops with some of the newer hops.
Sure.
The beer finished very dry with a firm bitterness, and I did not detect any off flavors. And like I said, it was very enjoyable to drink.
Yeah, and we are our own worst critics. At least most of us who aren't, completely off on the narcissism scale. We tend to criticize our beer the most. I think most brewers tend to fall in that camp. And we're going to be the ones, having known everything crazy that we did to brew these beers, we're usually going to be the first ones to be like, crap, I picked something off here. And in your case, you didn't, and I think that's really neat. I think the fact that you were able to drink this beer after spending just 2 hours brewing it, and you're like, wow, it's pretty good. This tastes pretty good. You might change the hops, sure. But none of the process stuff, at least in your opinion, didn't seem to change. Of course, it's not our opinion that matters. You served this beer to 29 blind tasters. Now, they were all informed of the style before being asked to evaluate it based on their previous experiences with Rye IPA, as well as the BJCP style description, which we provide in the survey. Now, we ask a ton of questions on this. We're going to break down every single one of those now. In terms of how hoppy, malty, and dry the beer was, tasters seem to perceive the strongest characteristic as being its hoppiness and dryness, which yielded average ratings of about 3.6 and 3.7 out of 5, respectively. And then ratings on malty were around 2.1 out of 5. That makes perfect sense to me for IPA in general, but especially Rye IPA, which, if anything, isn't supposed to be malt forward necessarily, but just have some of that body from the rye malt.
Yeah, that's exactly what you're looking for in an IPA, right? You want the hoppiness and the dryness to kind of be the first thing that, or the most distinct thing that tasters get out of this, where, the maltiness is just hanging out there in the back, just giving a little support.
Exactly. Now, in terms of hop character, right, we asked each person to break down their thoughts on the hop character, malt character, and yeast character. 13 out of the 29 tasters endorsed pine resinous as being the most prominent hop character that they detected. That kind of goes along with what you said, and maybe that contributes to this kind of, I guess, perception of spice, or almost this modulated version of what our brains think of as spice. That makes sense to me.
Sure. Yeah. Again, I think it was just kind of the hop choice that was giving me more of that spiciness, like you said, just that classic C, CTZ thing coming through.
Yeah. Makes perfect sense to me. 7 of the 29 tasters endorsed fruit. 3 each rated earthy and floral. 1 each said spicy, melon, and dank caddy. And then nobody endorsed berry or onion garlic. Those are 2 of the most unique hop characteristics that rarely get endorsed. But overall, that does not sound too off of your classic American IPA to me. 13 people saying pine resinous, and then another 7 saying fruit. Those 2 things together sound like IPA to me, or like a classic American IPA to me.
Yeah, for sure.
So then in terms of malt character, 9 out of the 29 rated cracker and bread crust as being the most prominent malt character. 8 said toasty, 6 said nutty, 3 said caramel sweet, 3 said roast, and nobody endorsed chocolate. I don't know how anybody would detect roast in this, but people perceive things differently, and we just have to roll with it. This was 29 blind tasters. All they knew that was the style. They didn't know how it was brewed. But 9 out of 29 saying cracker bread crust, and then 8 saying toasty. That makes perfect sense to me given the grain bill. I'm not sure there's much else we'd expect from that. I guess maybe special roast might contribute a whisper of roast character.
I guess if you've ever... if you just eat it right out of the the bin, I don't get like a roasty like a roast from you'd use in a stout or anything. It just, like I said, it's like a victory. It's supposed to give you that toasty, biscuity kind of thing, which I can see why maybe some people had toasty as the most prominent malt character. But I I mean, even looking at the beer, it wasn't dark at all. So I'm not really sure where that kind of roast comment, came from. Anyways, that's what they got. So
I sometimes wonder if people fat finger these things every once in a while. Who knows? Who knows? It happens every time, but we're going to report what we find. I mean, we're not going to go and change this stuff. So in terms of yeast character, 16 out of 29 in easy majority rated the fermentation character as being clean. 5 people put esters. I have to believe that some people mix up esters for hop, the hop fruitiness.
Sure.
I don't know. But 5 people did say esters, 4 said phenolics, 3 said sulfur, and 1 said wild. Again, I mean, that's a small minority of people, but if they detected it, I guess we have to take them on faith that they perceived it.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the phenolic one was kind of strange to me just because of the yeast choice and the amount of yeast I pitched, if you will. So, people get what they get, I guess.
Exactly. And honestly, there are some things where I'm thinking, man, as the brewer, I would fully have expected you to pick up if there was any phenols in your beer. And I have to imagine there probably weren't.
Although, I wonder if, maybe a combination of like the hop, the hop regimen with the dryness, maybe
possibly,
you could get like a phenolic thing, maybe.
Or what could be mistaken for a phenol. I get that.
Right. Perceived, perceived as a phenol, yeah.
Well, in the end, when we asked tasters to, identify any off flavors, one person noted that they got acetaldehyde and grassy, and then another person noted astringent and phenolic. None of the other 27 tasters noted any off flavors, and I'm wont to go with the majority on this one. I'm a big majority rules guy. So the fact that 27 tasters and you, Mike, did not perceive any off flavors leads me to believe that there likely just weren't any off flavors in this beer, though maybe those 2 people were absolutely correct. The fact they didn't agree on the off flavor is kind of funny to me, but who knows,
Right. Yeah. I mean, the whole grassy thing that can come through depending in an IPA, depending on how much and how long, right, you're hopping or dry hopping. So I guess I could see maybe, getting a grassy flavor. But the other 3, it was kind of head scratchers. So
grassy is such a weird off flavor to me that I've only ever gotten in really, it's like a buddy of mine made a dry hopped pale lager type of thing. And that one I actually picked up like what I would call like a chlorophyll flavor. And that's what my brain associates as grassy. Yeah. There was just kind of this green grassy character to it. That wasn't necessarily bad. Like I still drank the beer, but that was the only time I've ever actually picked up that kind of grass clipping note in beer. I don't know how you would get it in a beer like IPA like this, but hey, again, some people do. So,
right.
One of my favorite questions. So you look at all of the stuff we just talked about, and so far to me, this is sounding like a fairly standard rye IPA. It's got all of those kind of classic hop characteristics that you expect in an old school American IPA. It's got low malt, it's dry, it's hoppy. One of the things that we end up asking at the end of the survey is how well does this version of rye IPA that you're drinking now represent the style based on your past experience and what the BJCP description that we provide. And we allow tasters to rank it on a 5-point scale, right? Well, 3 out of 29 tasters rated it a 5 out of 5, meaning they think it's a perfect representation of the style. And then another 15 gave it a 4 out of 5, which, by my interpretation means that they think it's a pretty damn good, version of rye IPA. Another 6 rated it a 3 out of 5. So right there, you've got 18 plus 3 is 21 people so far out of 29 are giving it a 3 out of 5 or higher. 4 people said a 2 out of 5. 1 person rated it a 1 out of 5, but nobody, Mike, gave it a 0 out of 5. So good job.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd like to know who that one person was.
Yeah, who gave it the 1 out of 5?
Gave it a 1 out of 5. Yeah,
it's probably one of the people who detected roast in the beer. I mean, who knows?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no, I thought, personally, I thought the beer was very representative of the style, and it kind of had everything that I was looking for in a rye IPA.
That's awesome. Well, and we also asked tasters about their preference, how much they liked this beer. 8 people gave it a 5 out of 5. Man, to me, that's impressive. That 8 out of 29 people thought, I love this beer. I would drink it all the time. Another 9 gave it a 4 out of 5. 6 people rated it a 3 out of 5. To me, 3, 4, and 5 out of 5 are like they would order this beer at the bar. If it was on tap at a bar. 4 people rated it a 2 out of 5. 2 people rated it a 1 out of 5. Probably just not big IPA fans, is my guess. Sure. But then nobody gave it a 0 out of 5.
Yeah. So I think I would have given this beer, maybe like a 4 out of 5, 3 out of 5. Like I said earlier, the whole hopping. And this is all personal preference for me, but the hopping I thought was maybe a tiny bit clashing with the CTZ mixed with the New World kind of Galaxy stuff. I think next time I probably would have, maybe gone more, traditional C hops all the way through, or gone like the other way with the kind of the New World hop stuff.
Sure.
But yeah, I thought it was a good beer overall.
Yeah, I mean, it looked really good to me. I like the description that you gave of it, and I did think it was interesting. You use CTZ, and then you also used Columbus Lupamax, which, effectively Columbus is CTZ.
Right,
but that
right.
Lupamax I've found just has that more pungent, I guess, fresh hop character, whereas CTZ, your regular T90 pellets, does have that. What I have come to experience is more of a more pine forward thing. So maybe that's where some of that resinous pine character came from. But all in all, this beer sounds like it was really good. And the fact so many people not only thought it was a good representation of the style, but preferred it on top of you enjoying it. Yeah, I would probably, change the hop regimen up a little bit myself, just looking at what you did. I would probably favor more of the Centennial Citra Simcoe thing, just because I love that classic IPA character. But man, I feel like given what you did to this beer and then the way you brewed it and all the corners you cut, it came out really well for a short and shoddy beer yet again.
Yeah, I was definitely happy with this one.
Yeah. And it was generally well received as well. I mean, so not only did you like it, but other people liked it. And to me, that's just proof of this in the pudding type of thing, that you can get away with brewing a beer. And albeit, we're brewing on 240 volt electric systems, so it's a little bit quicker for us. But I know people who have 120 volt systems who are brewing traditional, brewing methods, and it's taken them 5-6 hours to do that. And you could do a short and shoddy in 3 hours on a 120 volt system if you plan your day properly. And I think that's pretty cool for people who might be a little bit pressed for time, that you're not going to brew a disaster of a beer, that you can actually get away with making something really good. So we do have a couple of reader comments I'd like to get to. Alan Skinner says, what would you change in your next batch? Which I know we already talked a little bit about, but maybe you can go into a little bit more detail, Mike. And do you prefer the standard or short and shoddy process of making beer?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing I would have changed, like I said before, was just the hopping regimen. I would have stuck either with your old classic, C hop, or, like you said, Amarillo, Simcoe, and Centennial sounds great. Or, gone with more of a Galaxy, Mosaic, Citra, and I'd pick one direction or the other to go, I think. And then as far as the brew day itself, which do I prefer? It kind of depends on what I'm doing. I mean, if I have, and not an all day, but if I have, 6-7 spare hours to brew, I'll go with your standard kind of brew day. But if I need something quick to, something like this to get out, like quick, I'm brewing on a weekday, after my kid's already gone to sleep. The 30-minute mash, 30-minute boil is just an awesome way to get the beer out quicker. And it's a good way to, I know, speaking from personal experience, like people in my club, they don't have the time to brew because it takes so long, where you can just maybe pull back some of those times, cut off, mash, cut off some boil, cut off some other, standard processes, if you will, and just get out there and brew. You got to go do it. Yeah, exactly. And don't be afraid to do it. I mean, I get that question a lot as well. Is, do you like doing standard brew days or short and shoddy better? It all has a place. If I'm like you said, if I've got to go drop my kids off at school on a Monday and I've got to edit a Brewlosophy podcast episode, and then I got to edit a brew lab, and I've only got 2 hours between finishing that up and going to pick my kids up, I'm going to do a short and shoddy batch without worry and knock one of those out versus a 4-hour, more convoluted traditional brewing process. Yeah, it's just another tool in your toolbox.
Exactly.
Just use whatever fits for whatever you got going on that day.
Yeah. Yep. Now, I didn't brew this beer, but to answer Alan's question that he asked you, what I would do differently is I probably would just go straight pale malt or Maris Otter. I love Maris Otter as a base for American IPA, but I would do like 20% rye malt just to ensure that I got that viscosity that I really love in a rye IPA. And then I would go, like you said, Amarillo, Simcoe, Centennial, maybe some Cascade, and just go super classic. And then I would fine it with gelatin. Those are the things that I would do differently that you didn't do, just to get it to where I want it to be. Next comment comes from Joe. He says, did your yeast cake include the dry hop material from the Sonnet Pale Ale, or do you use some sort of hop containment method that allowed you to remove those spent hops prior to adding the new wort?
No, yeah, this included everything. So, as I noted before, I opened the fermenter and then racked the short and shoddy rye directly onto the yeast cake with everything, with the kettle trube that I racked over from the sonnet, the wort, obviously, the dry hop, everything that was in there got racked on top of, the sonnet pale ale.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing. There's no way to say how big of an impact the sonnet hops that were in that yeast cake, how big of an impact it had on the flavor of the beer, but the beer still turned out. And that's a part of this whole short and shoddy thing. Would it be an interesting experiment in the future to compare, say, a classic American pale ale, like a single hop pale ale that is fermented with a fresh pouch of yeast, and then one that's racked onto a beer that has, say, a different hop in the yeast cake, and to see if that hop somehow impacts the flavor profile of the beer compared to one that is fermented with clean yeast? I think that'd be really interesting. The thing is, I have done in the beginning of Brewlosophy, one of my big focuses was on yeast. I mean, everybody was talking about how important yeast pitch rate is, how important it is to like rinse your yeast if you're going to reuse it, all of these things. Sort of what inspired the whole idea to harvest from starters is you wanted to pitch clean yeast. We have done a lot of comparisons of different methods of harvesting yeast. Both, I used to call it sloppy, like the stuff that has the trube and the hops in it, and it does not seem to have much of an impact. Does that mean that racking onto a full yeast cake that has a big 2-ounce dry hop on it doesn't have an impact? It certainly doesn't. But I would be curious to test that out in the future.
Yeah.
Well, Mike, that is all the time we've got for talking about Rye IPA. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we wrap things up?
Nothing about the style per se, but I would again just encourage you to try these methods, right? Try the 30-minute mash, try the 30-minute boil. There's no excuse not to go out and brew one of these because, as we've kind of shown over and over again, depending on what style you're brewing, you can probably get away with brewing a pretty damn good, example of it. So
absolutely.
Go do it.
Go do it. If you are pressed for time, if you find yourself not brewing because you feel like, oh man, I don't have time for 4 hours or 5 hours, we have been able to show over and over that you can make really good beer cutting a bunch of corners and brewing. It's the modern days. We don't need to be doing the things they were doing 100 years ago, unless you want to, which is perfectly cool. Also, go pick up some rye. You can use it in so many different styles, and I just love what it does to beer. So, well, remember to subscribe to the Brew Lab podcast, where host Cade Job takes you into the lab with brewing experts, so you're notified when new episodes drop. And don't forget that you can click the link in the description of this episode to read all about this short and shoddy Rye IPA. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it suits my bro. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through no middleman no more.